Hi everyone, this is Roman History. I'm Dr. Young. Today we want to talk about two main uh, figures in the beginning of late antiquity, or what we could also call the end of antiquity. The late 3rd century Emperor Diocletian and the early 4th century Emperor Constantine. This is a complicated sequence of events. We could call it a drama. I'm really surprised that no one has, to date, that I'm aware of at least, made a feature film about one or the other or both of these characters. I think actually a television series could do very well with this sequence of events. There's a lot that goes on here, a lot of drama, family drama, drama between major political players, a lot of intrigue. Monumentous changes in the entire empire. And so, this is a very interesting topic, but it does get complicated at times. I will try to simplify as much as I can, and really, I'm leaving out quite a bit here just for the sake of time and the amount of effort that we want to put into this. We don't necessarily need to know the name of every single person involved or what they did in every single year or anything like that. So long as we get, at least for our purposes, get the gist of the trajectory of this period. So last lecture we talked about the period of the barracks emperors, the middle half kind of the 3rd century, meaning from the year 235 to the year 285 or so. This 50-year period where there was absolute political chaos, emperors being assassinated repeatedly. Little by way of political stability, despite the Herculean efforts of emperors like Gallienus and Aurelian. Diocletian, like most of the emperors in that period before him, came from the military. He came not from a senatorial family, from a kind of middling family, but like others, worked his way up through the ranks. Diocletian was a capable battlefield commander, but that's not what gave him the advantage in Roman politics. It's really not the secret to his success. Diocletian had a knack for bureaucracy, for making plans, for organizing. He probably, and Thomas Africa said this in the textbook, he probably would make a pretty good CEO of a major corporation or something like that, but not necessarily most renowned for his kind of military achievements, right? But that's what Rome took at this point, and the changes that Diocletian managed to put into place gave Rome a new lease on life. It did so at a cost. The government of Rome changed. Arguably, life changed pretty significantly for a lot of the people under the sway of the empire, because of new taxes and new military requirements and things like that. There were dramatic changes, really, in some ways, but it did allow the empire to survive and last for another, a couple of centuries, really, but in more or less stable form for another century. The first thing that we have to understand with Diocletian, the most important change, and the one that all the other changes rely on, that he made, was the institution of the Tetrarchy. Okay, so in short, Diocletian decided, quite wisely as it turned out, that the empire would be best governed not by a single emperor with a bureaucracy underneath him, but rather by multiple figures who held the position of emperor, at least of some kind of roughly equal rank, right? So now, one of the reasons for this is that, as we saw in the middle of the 3rd century, much of the conflict and political instability came because of the fighting between different generals and the troops who supported each of those generals. Well, Diocletian reached out to several other generals. These were not, again, from senatorial families. These are military men. A couple of them were even of relatively humble circumstances. Galerius, for instance, the Eastern Caesar was. On one of these generals, Maximianus, Maximian, I guess, is the English. Anyway, upon Maximian, he proclaimed a roughly equal title of emperor. Made this agreement with him that Maximian would take charge of about half the empire, the western half. Diocletian, who had been a commander of legions in the east, specifically on the frontier with the Sassanid Empire, maintained rule in the east. Okay, so now we have an emperor in the west and an emperor in the east. And I just want to comment on that for a second. This is a structure that persists with a couple of exceptions all the way to, well, not just the end of the empire as a unified political entity around the end of the 5th century, but in some form at least, all the way through the Middle Ages, all the way to the 15th century. Okay, now I'll clarify that later on in the class. So, this division of West and East is really important and something that endures despite the efforts of some later emperors to achieve a kind of unity or to re-achieve a kind of unity after the empire had been broken up, in the case of Justinian in the 6th century, for instance. Now, in addition to that, of course, one of the issues that had always bedeviled the empire was the issue of succession of an emperor. To solve that, Diocletian and Maximian, drawing upon trends that were already in place and to some extent go back to the 2nd century situation where under the Antonine rulers, the ruling emperor would choose his successor. Okay, so each of the two emperors chose a junior partner. This statue that you see here, which is now in St. Mark's Basilica in Venice, but only because in 1204 the crusading armies of the Fourth Crusade sacked Constantinople. It had previously been in, I believe, either the royal palace in Constantinople or in the Hagia Sophia, the church built by Justinian in the 6th century. In any case, it was there, but it ended up being pilfered by the Crusaders and taken to Venice. It does not belong in Venice. It is very fittingly, something from the former Eastern Roman Empire. And this shows each of the senior emperors, these guys on the right side of the two sets of figures, this guy and this guy, with the arms wrapped around their partner. These are the senior emperors, so this would be Diocletian and Maximian, or vice versa. I'm not sure which one is which. And then the two junior emperors, Diocletian's junior emperor was named Galerius, and Maximian's junior emperor was named Constantius. Now, as far as titles go, the two senior emperors took the title of Augustus. This was something that was sort of par for the course, going all the way back to Augustus Caesar. The emperors had been known by that title. And the two junior emperors took the title of Caesar. Now, this was also not something new. At least in part of the 3rd century, some of the ruling emperors, as they proclaimed an heir, would call that heir the Caesar. Okay, so they're drawing upon existing precedent, but they're really sort of codifying that, making it a permanent structure. All right. Now, what this means kind of geopolitically is that the two Augusti split up each their half of the empire and gave half to, in other words, a fourth of the empire now, the fourth of the full empire, to the Caesars to govern. Okay. Now, these are all military men, and they govern, much like the barracks emperors before them had governed, from frontier towns. Okay, so I'll come back to that point in a second here. All right, first I want to talk about something else that's important associated with the Tetrarchy and with Diocletian specifically. Diocletian had a different view of emperors than was traditional in the Roman Empire. For one, and this can be encapsulated in the title that he preferred, and he wasn't the first to do this, but he was the first to really put this into effect. His preferred title was the word Dominus. Now this replaces the word Princeps, not that all of the emperors from Augustus on had used the title Princeps, but there's this kind of public persona that goes along with the emperors who ruled in the mold of Augustus Caesar, that they would be accessible, they would be seen as kind of the first citizen, and even though they held extraordinary powers and wealth and other things that nobody else held, they were still, operating in this more traditional vein, even drawing upon some of the kind of ideologies of the Republic, right? The word dominus makes no mistake about the power the emperor is claiming. Dominus means lord. It even has religious connotations, and there are times when Diocletian and his partners in the Tetrarchy were even called dominus et deus. Okay, the word you see here on the slide, deus means God, right? So Lord and God. Now, this is not the first time that emperors have claimed divinity. That goes again back to Augustus Caesar, or even, in the aftermath of the assassination, to Julius Caesar. But even while they're living, they are claiming that title. Now, there are things that go along with this. Okay, I'll go back to that. Okay, so Diocletian and some other emperors had begun to do this, but Diocletian truly modified the kind of the persona, not just the title, but also the appearance of the emperor. He began to wear clothes that looked more like the Persian ruler than any Roman emperor who had come before him. Fancy robes, large amounts of material, jeweled shoes, kind of like elf boots that turned up at the toe. When he held public audiences, it turned into a kind of show. They would put makeup with gold dust on their faces and sprinkle gold dust in their hair so that they appeared divine. He didn't necessarily, make himself accessible to the Roman public. He was a military emperor, but the palaces that the Tetrarchy built left them rather inaccessible, and really in some ways neglected those, or just completely ignored those who had previously held power, like the senators, for instance. Right. Now, in terms of military policies, this is something that is an ever-evolving situation. There was really a kind of debate between two main military strategies. One of these would be to have mobile armies that were stationed behind the front lines or behind the frontier, meaning, for instance, the Danube River or the Rhine River, or the border between Syria and the Sassanid Empire, between Syria and Mesopotamia. And that if there was an invasion, if the Goths, a group of the Goths broke through or sailed across the Black Sea or something like that, that these mobile armies could be sent to intercept them. And because they traveled light and were flexible, they could pretty much be sent anywhere in rather rapid fashion. Well, Gallienus in the 3rd century, for instance, had employed armies like this. And Constantine would do this, I should say, after Diocletian. Diocletian preferred, instead of that tactic or that strategy, to station all of his army directly on the border, and to erect much more sure defenses, stone walls, garrison keeps, things like this, all along the borders, to have fixed defenses, in other words. And the emperors themselves, the 4 members of the Tetrarchy, governed from frontier capitals. If we look at the way that this was split up geographically, Diocletian did not rule from Rome like other emperors had. He remained with his soldiers over here in the city of Nicomedia, which was, well, some distance, of course, all of Asia Minor pretty much, from Mesopotamia, but closer to the frontier. Galerius, up here, the Caesar in the east, ruled from the Danube frontier, the city of Sirmium, just a small frontier town, but he took that as his capital and set up his court there. Maximian ruled from Milan, and so far in the north, on the kind of up in the foothills of the Alps, and Constantius, who actually spent much of his life in Britannia. He ruled from the garrison frontier town of Trier. in what is now Western Germany. Okay, so what's being neglected here? Well, Rome and other prominent cities like Antioch. It is curious he doesn't rule from Antioch. He preferred Nicomedia, simply had a power base there, and that's where he set up his court. Alexandria is being neglected, right? Carthage and other places. In favor of, especially these three, these frontier towns. Now, a number of things happen that we don't necessarily want to get into a lot of details. Both Diocletian and Galerius, his Caesar, campaigned against the Sassanid Persians in this period, the Emperor Narses specifically. Galerius is the one who actually took the lead in this. Diocletian spent some time in Egypt putting down a revolt. Galerius is the one who did most of the fighting. Sorry about that. Most of the fighting against the Persians. After being defeated in a major battle, he regrouped his forces and attacked the Sassanids and managed to penetrate into the Sassanid Empire all the way to the city of Ctesiphon, which had been the Parthian capital. And for that reason, because of these great successes that Galerius had, and Diocletian and Galerius both also campaigned on the northern frontier along the Danube, and were successful there. Galerius witnessed himself holding a kind of prestige that the other members of the Tetrarchy didn't. So even though Maximian was technically the Augustus, the favored other member of the Tetrarchy was Galerius. He was the one who seems to have influenced or had the most pull on Diocletian himself. There was no question in the Tetrarchy, it should be said, that Diocletian was in charge. That he was the senior Augustus, he was the senior emperor over all the others. Okay. Now, other than that, there's a kind of division of authority, right? And this is not just a territorial division of authority, but it's also a division of authority between civilian officials and military officials. Increasingly, especially in the frontier provinces, the military officials, the generals, the leaders of legions, were the ones who were given power, even power over kind of civilian rule. Now this is complicated because Diocletian and the members of the Tetrarchy also preside over this expansion of the governmental bureaucracy. They dissolved, and this is a major change, of course, dissolved all of the existing provinces. Went away from the kind of ad hoc arrangement of provincial governance that Rome had used from the time of Augustus, or even going back into the Republican period. Instead, created about 100 new provinces based on, kind of ease of governance and splitting things up bureaucratically and geographically in ways that made sense to them. And then they also created this middle, so between let's see if the map demonstrates this here. Okay, so there are these other layers of geographic organization. So about 100 provinces. These are not shown on the map. Neither are the middle divisions. Okay, so each of the 4 areas here, shown in different colors. The yellow over here for the this is called the prefecture of Gaul. Okay, this is the prefecture of Italy. This is the prefecture of Greece, and this is the prefecture of the East. These 4 divisions, as I've said, are called prefectures. And then each prefecture was divided into 3 geographic units, each of which was called a diocese. And the head of a diocese was not called a governor like the head of a province was. Instead, the head of a diocese was called a vicar. Okay, now you may note that both the word diocese and the word vicar would later be co-opted by the church, by the Catholic Church specifically, and later by other kind of offshoots of the Catholic Church, to be titles of church administration and church office. Okay, there are reasons for that, and in the next lecture, and really for the rest of the term, we're going to be talking about the embrace of Christianity by the empire and the influence that has on things. So one of these is this move, toward a kind of mixed government initially, and then to church officials taking on more and more responsibilities. Well, that borrows these terms or these geographic governmental units that were put into place by the Tetrarchy. And what that also means is that with 100 new provinces and the creation of the dioceses and the creation of the prefectures, each of which, so we've got 4 imperial courts now, okay, instead of just one court of an emperor. And of course, each court of the emperor had a number of court officials, hangers-on, other things. And so that's an expansion of the governmental apparatus or the bureaucracy. And then each diocese has a number of officials, and then each of the provinces has a number of officials. And so we move from a government which is really kind of bare bones, only, the 300 or 400 members of the senators and the few hundred members of the class of the equites, and various army officers, now to a much expanded bureaucracy with many more government officials, many more people directly beholden to, or rather, part of the larger and larger hierarchy of the Roman government. So this is an important change as well. In fact, later on, this of course is going to evolve into the Eastern Roman Empire, otherwise known as the Byzantine Empire. And the word Byzantine tends to denote, at least when used as an adjective, tends to denote something that is overly bureaucratic, that is, tremendously complicated, kind of labyrinthine. That expansion of the bureaucracy leading to that, the associated term Byzantine begins with the Tetrarchy. Now, economic policies, okay, so to feed the beast, as it were, to pay this expanded bureaucracy and to pay, of course, the armies who were in the employ, and the armies grow in this period. Probably upwards of 500,000 soldiers are in arms as a member of one of the 4 major armies, each commanded by a member of the Tetrarchy. That's a great expansion. So they need more and more money. They institute new taxes, specifically, and they actually did away with some older taxes, but these were more oppressive, and they were more they were better organized. They were collected more effectively. So there's a land tax. Every unit of land, every farm, was calculated by the number of jugera, the Roman measure of land size, the number of jugera involved, and was issued a tax that they owed. This could be paid in kind. And then there was also a head tax. Every person had to owed a certain amount of tax, usually paid in money, to the Roman government. This is another reason why they need an expanded bureaucracy. And, this saw an uptick, it seems, at least. There's not a lot of data on this, but it seems a pretty good uptick in the number of, the amount of revenue coming into the government. Okay. Now, we saw in the 3rd century how inflation was a major issue. That didn't necessarily change. Diocletian's major solution to the problem of inflation was to issue something called the Edict of Maximum Prices. Now, I don't want to go into this in great detail, but this is an incredibly valuable source. You can find it online at this website called forumancientcoins.com. Normally, I would not advise you to rely on websites that have names like that have a .com codec to them, but this actually does give you that document. Okay. In the introduction to the Edict on Maximum Prices, Diocletian notes here, if the excess is perpetrated by persons of unlimited and frenzied avarice or greed, in other words, could be checked by some self-restraint. And then he goes on to elaborate on avarice, how bad it is, how greedy people are. Then, as he says, the situation could perhaps be faced with dissembling in silence, with the hope that human forbearance might alleviate the cruel and pitiable situation. So he blames the problem of inflation on greed. He just thinks people are being greedy, okay? And so, to make sure that they cannot be greedy, to try to manage this from the central government, he institutes this thing called the Edict on Maximum Prices, where he sets what's called in economic terms a price ceiling. Now, this is especially helpful because they then give the amount of money that people can charge, the maximum amount they can charge for specific goods. And there are a number of fascinating questions we can ask about this document. One quite obvious one is, what did Romans eat? Well, they ate things like wheat, barley, rye, millet, panic grass. I have no idea what that is. This must be the lowest type of grain there is. It is, in any case, because it's the cheapest, along with whole millet, which is not even ground. That's something that still has to be processed. Panic grass, I don't know if this had to be processed. I kind of think this is like, some really cheap grain that doesn't have to be ground so much. I don't know. Frankly, I have no idea what panic grass is. I should probably look that up. Every time I teach this document, I say I don't know what panic grass is. It's got to be just the worst food you could possibly eat. I don't know. Anyway, they also ate beans and lentils and peas and things like that. They ate rice and barley and sesame seeds. Okay. Sesame seeds, by the way, very, very expensive. They're twice the amount that a modius is a measurement. Twice the amount that a modius of wheat were, right? Different kinds of wine, and much like today, you have your expensive wines, the ones that come from France or Spain or Italy or someplace like that, and then you have like cheap wines, okay? And frankly, again, I have little idea about this because I don't actually drink wine or any kind of alcohol, though I have many friends who do, so I have some sense of this, I guess. You have ordinary wine, like I don't even know what that is. Does this have like the grapes still in it or something? Why is it so vastly cheaper than the Piscine, Tiburtine, Sabine, or Falernian wine, right? Egyptian beer must be just the worst, okay, as far as drinking alcohol goes, because it's very cheap, right? If you're going to drink beer, I suppose at least drink the Gallic or the Pannonian. Don't drink the Egyptian beer, right? You got different kinds of oil. Salt, of course, very, very important for everyone's diet and for preserving food and things like that. Expensive, but not prohibitively. The same amount of salt as as a measure of wheat. Salt costs roughly the same. Okay. Sorry, it's actually very late where I am, and I'm falling asleep. I'm not falling asleep, but I will be yawning. Pork is more valuable than beef, interestingly. Okay. By far the most expensive meat is fattened pheasant, meaning domesticated pheasant that's raised on some kind of farm. A wild pheasant is only half the price. Chickens are pretty expensive too. So you're going to eat meat and you have little money, then you're going to buy pork or beef, right, instead of, or especially pork mince meat here, although that's only 1 ounce. But fattened pheasant is only for the really wealthy people. You get different kinds of fish. Now, this also gives the prices or the wages that the government was trying to standardize for specific jobs, right? So you can see that a farm laborer makes half as much as a carpenter, which is a skilled laborer. A wall painter makes half again as much, and then a picture painter, somebody who actually is hired by people to paint portraits. This would be the wealthy paying them, obviously. Makes twice as much as a wall painter. Okay. Some workers make very little, right? Though we have no idea. I mean, if a barber had a huge clientele and got 2 denarii per person he shaved or cut their hair, then he might make a fair amount of money. I don't know. Some teachers were not so well paid. Other teachers, seems some subjects in particular, are more valued than others. To teach elementary education only brought in a fairly low wage, but then to teach arithmetic or shorthand, in other words, to teach people to do math or to write, earned them a great deal more money. But, the teacher of the Greek or Latin language and literature, or especially the teacher of public speaking, remember, this is one of the most valuable skills in the ancient world, that teacher made the most money. Lawyers made much more than anybody else, as you can see. Right? So this is a helpful document. It's something that we can use in a number of ways to answer questions we might have about the ancient world, or about this period of time anyway. It didn't work. The edict on maximum prices was a terrible idea. Economically, this creates shortage. If you, I mean, supply or rather demand outstrips supply in this case, where you're not trying to meet economic equilibrium. This did produce a black market, even though the penalties for doing so were severe, even capital punishment at times, but people risked that. So it had little effect, honestly, and by the end of Diocletian's reign, the edict on maximum prices, it was pretty obvious, was doomed, and few people were still observing it. Now, the last couple things about Diocletian here. He decided, actually rather late in his reign, he had been emperor for about 15 years before he really put this into effect, but he decided to persecute Christians systematically. Why did he do this? Well, Christians, as we've said, had been tolerated. Certain emperors had even kind of embraced Christianity. Severus Alexander, one of the Severins, Philip the Arab, the emperor in the 240s, or late 240s, early 250s, I guess. He also seems to have had an affinity for Christianity, may have been a converted Christian. The Christianity had been persecuted under Valerian, but after Valerian's capture, it was legalized. And so, I mean, the general trend is actually in the direction of toleration. And Diocletian, even though Galerius especially was very anti-Christian, he seems to have had a fairly religiously fanatic mother who influenced him. Diocletian was in no mood to do this until some things happened. There were some offenses he felt committed against the emperor or against the worship of the traditional gods by the Christians. This is probably just rumor mongering, especially on the part of Galerius. But he decides to put this into effect. He declares Christianity to be illegal and imposes severe penalties on those who refuse to recant their religion if they are arrested and accused of believing in Jesus. As it turned out, this period of persecution had a couple of effects. One of these is that Christians remained, the popularity of Christianity grew if it did anything. Because the Christians proved to be so brave and so committed, Diocletian seems not to have understood that one of the points of Christianity, like other mystery religions, which we will talk about in the next class, by the way, one of the points of this is that people were striving for a great reward in the afterlife and not so much in this life. And so telling them we're going to kill you if you don't stop worshiping your God is not really a great solution to get them to stop worshiping the God, because they're like, fantastic, let me die, and then the God will reward me handsomely in the next life. That's what I really want. And when Diocletian saw that this didn't work very well, he eventually rescinded it. Even Galerius put into place an edict of toleration. This was from the beginning unevenly enforced. Both Maximian and Constantius in the West had little interest in this and did almost nothing with it. So this was not enforced everywhere. And though it did go down in sort of Christian lore as this time of great persecution, this would be a foundational epoch for the Christians later on, especially because of the works of Eusebius, his lengthy descriptions about the heroic deaths of these Christian martyrs and things like that. Now, Diocletian, 20 years into his reign, year 305, decides to abdicate, meaning step down from his position as emperor. At the same time, he forces Maximian, the other Augustus, to do the same. Why? Well, that's a debated point, okay? It is possible, we might even say probable, that Diocletian had promised Galerius. Again, Galerius had a prestige in the Tetrarchy that was not equaled by any of the other members, even though he was only a Caesar. He had probably promised Galerius that after 20 years he would step down and Galerius would take over as Augustus, and this ensured the good behavior of Galerius, ensured that Galerius would not rise up and try to overthrow him by force. Or Diocletian may have just, decided that he wanted to make sure that his system worked, that succession would go from the Augustus to the Caesar without any kind of debate or problem or uprising And it worked. Maximian, it should be said, seems not to have been thrilled with this, because at first opportunity he comes kind of running back into politics. But they both stepped down, and Galerius and Constantius took the title of Augustus. They chose new Caesars, both of them, it should be said, Severus in the west Severus in the east. To get this straight, Severus in the east and Maximian Daia in the west. Or it could be vice versa. Anyway, I can't remember. They were both closely tied to Galerius, not to Constantius. That shows the prestige that Galerius had here. He was the one really in charge of the whole transfer of power, the whole succession thing. Now, this gets complicated at this point, really complicated, if it's not already. Okay, and this is the part that I want to kind of breeze through without going into a lot of details, because we could get lost in the weeds here. All right. So Galerius and Constantius are the new Augusti. The Caesares are Maximinus Daia and Severus. Okay, both again friends of Galerius. In fact, Maximinus Daia was a relative, a nephew, something like that, of Galerius, and Severus was one of his friends. They become the Caesars. There were, it should be said, and this is going to become important, two princes of former members of the Tetrarchy, or actually in one case, a current member of the Tetrarchy. Maxentius, who was the son of Maximian, the former Augustus in the west, and Constantine, who was the son of Constantius. Both of them were adults. Both of them were proven commanders who extracted a lot of loyalty from their soldiers and such, right? So they both were very capable individuals. And they're both ambitious, but they were passed over in this transfer of power with the abdication of Diocletian and the ascension of Galerius and Constantius. That doesn't mean they were happy about this, okay? And so we're going to see they quickly move to try to find some foothold in the power structure of the new Tetrarchy. All right. Now, a year into this new arrangement, Constantius, the father of Constantine and the Western Caesar, the Western Augustus, I should say, the former Caesar, now Augustus, dies, and the soldiers in the West, in particular, had not had time, especially in the realms that Constantius had ruled now for over 20 years, places like Britain and Gaul, okay, they hadn't had time to become accustomed to the new Augustus, okay, or rather the new Caesar, to Severus. They were not thrilled with him being there, and they gave their loyalty to Constantine. Constantine probably encouraged this, almost certainly encouraged this. And so this creates some serious problems. The soldiers in the West, the legions along the Rhine, proclaim Constantine to be the new Augustus. Okay, and Severus is like, wait, that's my position, right? I am the Caesar. I should hold that position. But the troops are pretty convinced of this, right? Now, at the same time, Maxentius, who the other prince, the son of Maximian, he attacks Severus and takes over the city of Rome. Shortly after that defeat, Severus tries to counterattack and retake the city. He's unsuccessful at this. And not long after that, he dies. I can't remember whether he was murdered or anyway. He's now out of the picture, right? Maxentius had offered Constantine, especially after the death of Severus, actually even before the death of Severus, had offered Constantine the position of Augustus. He said, "Sure, I'll acknowledge you as that if you allow me to take Rome. We form an alliance. We split up the Western Empire." Okay, probably with the thought that, well, we'll save our fight for another day, and we'll start with some sort of status quo here. And Maximian backs this completely. Severus surrenders and dies. I guess he was killed actually in captivity. Now, Galerius, who was still the dominant member of the Tetrarchy, didn't accept either. Well, initially doesn't really accept either Constantine or Maxentius, but then he caves so long as they kind of hold a meeting, and Diocletian even gets involved in this. He comes out of retirement and tries to preside over something, to restore some sanity and some stability to the arrangement. Licinius, who was also a friend of Galerius, right? So Galerius is the one who's really kind of choosing all of these individuals. He is proclaimed to be the new Western Augustus. Had nothing to do with Tetrarchy up to this point other than being friends. Now he becomes the Western Augustus, right? Now things get complicated here. Maximian, the father of Maxentius, and also now the father-in-law of Constantine, because Constantine had divorced his first wife, and Minervina, I think is her name, and marries the daughter of Maximian, the sister of Maxentius. Her name is Fausta. Okay. And so they cement their partnership much as earlier emperors had done, right? But Licinius is declared as the Western Emperor, and both Maxentius and Constantine are proclaimed to be Caesars. Okay. Now Maximinus Daia is still around, it should be said. So now there are 3 Caesars, and things are a bit chaotic. Okay. Maximian has a falling out with Maxentius and flees now to Constantine. So he fights with his own son, flees to his son-in-law. They become allies for a time. And this sets up the rivalry between Constantine and Maxentius in the West. Okay. In the meantime, Galerius dies in the year 311, and Licinius, the Western Augustus, decides the East is much better, so he moves into the East, and eventually, and I'm leaving a lot out here, he eventually sort of takes over as the Eastern Augustus, and Constantine, especially after he defeats Maxentius at the Battle of Milvian Bridge in the year 312, Licinius is forced to acknowledge Constantine as the Western Augustus. Maximianus Daia, I should say, is still around, and he is sharing power in the East now with Licinius, but still sort of passed over. Never really makes the title of Augustus. Licinius and Constantine come together at this point and proclaimed what's called the Edict of Milan. This is a proclamation of toleration for Christianity. This is nothing necessarily new. These decrees had been made before by earlier emperors. Even Galerius, about a year or so previous to this, had issued an edict of toleration for Christians. The great persecutor, the one who was most committed to that, withdrew his commitment. And so, this is not anything that important except, or anything that shocking, I should say, except that Constantine starts to appear to be committed to Christianity. And that has to do with stories that are later told, but, may have some basis in reality. I don't know. Though there's a lot of supernatural involved in this. There's something that happened at the Battle of Milvian Bridge. As the story comes out, Constantine claims to have seen this vision where he was shown a Christian symbol, a Christian sign, and told, and I'll show you what that is in a minute here, by this, in hoc signo superbit, you will conquer. By this sign you will conquer. Okay. And so he takes up that sign, he paints it on the shields of his soldiers, he puts it on his banners. Now, later on, there's another version. This comes out in Eusebius's Life of Constantine, which is a much later work. But this is Constantine apparently told Eusebius, Eusebius claims that he actually saw a vision of a cross in the sky and heard the voice of Jesus proclaim to him that he should conquer by that sign. But the sign that he actually uses is called the Chi-Rho. It's not a cross. Okay, so I'll show that to you in a minute here. Now, Licinius and Maximian Daia have a Maximinus Daia. There's different names here. Anyway, one of them is anglicized. One of them is the Latin. Okay, so don't be confused. Anyway, they have a falling out. Licinius defeats him, and at that point, this is around the year 316 or so, Licinius moves to execute all of the families of all of the members of the Tetrarchy who are now defunct. Victims included Galerius's wife and his children, so they couldn't rise up to claim power, and Galerius's mother-in-law, who was actually the wife of Diocletian, okay, because Galerius married Diocletian's daughter. Diocletian had died in the year 313, and he, was seeing his creation crumble already. So Licinius and Constantine are now really the sole remaining members of this whole competitive game. Constantine was sharing power already with his sons in the West. He was the Augustus and had named at least one of his sons, eventually would name all of them Caesars. Now, long story short, Constantine eventually defeats Licinius. That's where I'm just going to skip over about 8 years of history here and not go into the details. But he campaigns into the east, comes into battle with Licinius, defeats him by the year 324, and Constantine is now in charge of the entire empire. Okay, this is the Chi-Rho symbol. All right, called so because it's 2 Greek letters. The X here is the letter Chi, and the P-looking thing is the letter Rho. Transliterated, these would be C or CH and R. Okay. In other words, the first 2 letters of the Greek word Christos, or Christ. Notice also that this symbol has an alpha and an omega, because Christ is the beginning and the end and all that, but the Chi-Rho is a symbol for Christ. Now, that's not to say that wasn't necessarily the only meaning of this, and I'll talk about that in a minute here. Constantine is arguably the most important emperor in Roman history after Augustus Caesar. Diocletian is very important, but Constantine puts into place changes that are in so many ways even more far-reaching, more influential than anything that Diocletian did. He took over the parts of Diocletian that worked really well, ditched the others, and then added a bunch more changes to it, right? So let's go through these briefly. One, Constantine adopts the earlier approach of mobile field armies, all right, meaning the armies of the empire are going to be far more flexible and operate behind the lines, but be able to meet challenges all over the empire, okay? Second thing, he stabilizes the currency, does away with the Edict on Maximum Prices, and he enacted a number of changes. One of the most important is his monetary policy of creating a single currency that sort of serves as a peg for the rest of the monetary system. If you don't understand the language I'm using here, he essentially creates a gold coin called the solidus. Not, I think, the first time that term was used. Translated in English, it tends to be shilling, okay? But all the other coins are kind of standardized or pegged to that single currency, which helps to create a stable system. So we no longer have different kinds of coins being minted by different people. Members of the Tetrarchy had each minted their own coins. This had led to some confusion. Exchange rates were problematic and things like that. Okay, so the gold coinage stabilizes that to some extent. Of course, one of the far-reaching changes that Constantine puts into place is that he creates a new capital. Now, to say the new capital that wasn't necessarily what Constantine intended from the beginning. But much like many earlier conquerors like Alexander the Great had done, and many Roman emperors, as we've seen, styled themselves after Alexander, he created this city in the east out of an existing city, the Greek polis of Byzantium. He turned this into a new city and called it after himself, Constantinople or Constantinopolis. Polis in Greek, of course, means city, right, or city-state. So that, and he begins to pour a lot of resources, a lot of money into this. He incentivizes people in the West. There had already been a lot of migration of elites from the West to the East as the power base under Diocletian and even earlier emperors had moved in that direction. The East was more urbanized, more economically vibrant, more culturally viable. It was superior in so many ways to the West, even to the city of Rome, that people were already moving there. Constantine builds a lot of buildings. He builds a massive hippodrome there, not nearly the size of the hippodrome in Rome, but that thing had kind of fallen into disrepair by this point. The new hippodrome, and I coincidentally was just there a couple of days ago. In fact, the last lecture that I filmed from Istanbul. But the hippodrome is, I mean, you can still see where it was. Some of the obelisks, they imported obelisks from Egypt, from the old pharaonic periods in Egypt. And they stood in the center of the hippodrome, and you can see essentially how the track was laid out, even though the stands and the walls and things are now gone, right? I mean, it's now called Sultan Ahmet Square after the mosque that stands next to it, which is also called the Blue Mosque. Anyway, all of that is still pretty visible in that city. So Constantinople, he offers people even kind of economic incentives to move there. He creates a grain dole in Constantinople. He pours money into building an infrastructure, things like aqueducts in Constantinople. And people rapidly move from the west to this new city, such that into the reign of his successor, one of his sons, Constantine II, Constantinople effectively takes over as the center of power and as the capital, as the new Rome. His most lasting contribution, though, was his embrace of Christianity. Now, this is a highly debated point, not just historically, but in religious terms. There are religions that rely heavily on the actions of Constantine, and there are those who see Constantine as almost an antichrist figure, someone who messed everything up, right? The truth is that his religious opinions were probably pretty complicated. For one, the Chi Rho, that symbol was also used by worshippers of the cult of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, which was a sun god that had become quite popular in Rome in the 3rd century. And so Constantine himself seems to have had an affinity for Sol Invictus and may have even conflated Jesus with Sol Invictus. In any case, his embrace of the religion may have been from just a kind of confusion over who exactly Christ was, or that, he may have thought that this is acceptable because, sort of represents both figures and not kind of worry about that, right? If we could interview Constantine, I'd be very interested to know what his exact religious opinions were. It is obvious that he believes in something, though, and we should not be cynical, I think, here, at least not too cynical, and say Constantine's doing all of this out of greed, because this doesn't make a lot of sense. The Christians, even though it was a significant and visible minority, it's only a small percentage of the people in the empire at this point who are Christian. Constantine poured a ton of resources into this. He devotes a tremendous amount of attention to the issue of Christianity, to trying to stabilize the religion and turn it into something that he can use to unify his empire culturally and politically. And that should not be discounted. Okay. Now, he does have the ear of, or rather some of the bishops in Christianity, the urban leaders of urban Christian communities began to have his ear. Some of them convince him that there are, doctrines or forms of Christianity that are unacceptable. And I haven't talked about this yet. I almost hesitate to get into this now, but suffice it to say that at this point, Christianity is not a unified movement, not anywhere close to that. Okay, because by this point, it's been around for 3 centuries, and Christian populations were now found all over the Mediterranean and many points beyond. In the 4th century, we begin to have a thriving community of Christians, for instance, in Ethiopia, all the way down in sub-Saharan Africa. There are Christians as far away as India, which coincidentally is where I'm filming this lecture. I'm not sure they were in the exact area that I'm in Delhi, but Delhi wasn't kind of around by that point. But in any case, Christians are all over the place, and each Christian community had developed its own little form of Christianity that differed sometimes in great details, even in matters of a kind of essential belief with other Christian communities, right? And the persecutions of the 3rd century had exacerbated these divisions. There was a group in North Africa, for instance, called the Donatists, who held that anyone who had compromised at all during the times of persecution, who had handed Christian scriptures over to the Roman authorities, who had recanted or thought about recanting or anything were no longer worthy. Their priesthood should be stripped from them, and that only these pure kind of martyr-minded Donatists were the ones who were true Christians. The Donatists sought persecution. For a time, in around 317 or so, Constantine gave in to the demands of these Western bishops and began to persecute the Donatists, round them up. Turns out, much like Diocletian and Galerius' experience, it didn't really help matters to persecute religiously committed people. And after about 3 years, he kind of ignores the bishops and no longer he makes Donatism legal. Okay, so this is a complicated narrative, right? The most significant action in favor of Christianity, arguably, and this one has far-reaching consequences, is his calling together of what is hailed as the first ecumenical council in Christian history, a gathering of Christian bishops in the city of Nicaea, which is close to Nicomedia, also very close to the new city of Constantinople, which at this point is not really that established. But Constantine's working on it, right? So he calls together this massive meeting of bishops. The bishops came together and debated the points of doctrine and practice and church government and things like this, debated issues like which books from the early Christian period should be held as scripture. The New Testament, the Christian canon, in other words, had not yet taken completely canonized shape, and so they debated that. They debated who God was and what God's nature was, right? From the Council of Nicaea comes the doctrine of the Trinity, the belief in a unified God of Christianity, but one who had three different parts, right? The Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and all of that. And I don't want to get into the details of the theology of this, but this council is tremendously influential. It produces a set of beliefs, even a statement of beliefs called the Nicene Creed, which was added onto by later councils, but one that is still recited in many Christian churches all over the world to the present, right? So this council is really, really important. Now, what were Constantine's exact kind of loyalties? Where did they lie? It probably toward a form of Christianity that was not the one determined upon at the Council of Nicaea. In fact, the chief proponent of the doctrine of the Trinity, Athanasius of Alexandria, later was on the outs with Constantine. And Constantine, once he was baptized by a bishop from the Arian sect. And I'll explain who the Arians are later. This is not to be confused, by the way, with Arian, the whole racial ideology of the 19th century. This is Arian. But Constantine is baptized by an Arian bishop, and even his successors go on with Arian Christianity. So I'll discuss what that is in the next lecture. Now, Constantine, it's fairly clear, not fairly, it's completely obvious that the Christian church he envisioned was one that would be governed by the emperor, okay? Where the emperor would hold both religious and secular authority. This is encapsulated by the term Caesaropapism. That is the standard operating procedure of the emperors in the East all the way to the 15th century. They hold to this. Caesaropapism really is the kind of, as I said, the governing philosophy of the whole Byzantine Empire all through its history. And it starts with Constantine. Constantine's mother is converted to Christianity before he did, and may have had an influence on his own opinions about this or his own actions. Her name was Helena. She becomes known as Saint Helena later on. But Constantine sends her over to the east, over to what Christians and Jews and Muslims call the Holy Land, okay, what is now Israel, Palestine. And Helena locates things. She finds in Jerusalem, for instance, a cross, and becomes convinced. Eusebius and others talk about the miracles that happened around the finding of this cross. But becomes convinced that this is the actual cross of Jesus Christ. And, Helena presides over the building of, and Constantine funds this, the building of a number of churches in the East. like the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, which supposedly, according to St. Helena, was the actual site of the birth of Jesus. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where the tomb of Jesus was in Jerusalem, and a number of other churches. And so the beginnings of this kind of sacred topography of the East, the pilgrimages that would mark one of the most important religious phenomena over the next 1,500 or so years. Helena and Constantine are the origins of that too, right? So many aspects of Christianity are put into place by Emperor Constantine. All of this is a bit ironic because he is not baptized until the very end of his life. The year 337, as he's on his deathbed, realizes he's probably not going to make it, decides to receive Christian baptism. So he did all of that without actually entering into the essential rite, it's R-I-T-E if you're keeping track, of Christianity. And when he does, like I said, he submits to an Arian bishop, not to one of these Orthodox bishops who had dominated the Council of Nicaea. So the identity of Christianity is really kind of crystallized by Constantine in some ways, but it remains open for debate despite the actions of Constantine. Now, in the last few years of Constantine's life, he witnesses a great deal of family drama, we might say, and this is the worst kind of drama, really. His oldest son, Crispin, by his first wife, who was of lower origin, he had divorced her, Minervina, to marry Fausta, the daughter of Maximian, as we said, and she had given birth to 3 sons. Constantine, who would become Constantine II, Constantius, who would become Constantius II, and Constans. They seem to have not been able to depart from the name Constans or various forms of it. At least that is the opening of these names. But she became jealous of Crispin, who was already proclaimed as a Caesar in the West. She feared that her 3 sons, would be passed over in favor of Crispin. And so she seems to have concocted, at least as far as we can discern, a charge that Crispin, her stepson, raped her. And she goes to Constantine and proclaims that he tried to rape her, or he did rape her. Constantine believes her and has his son executed. But then it comes out, there's evidence that seems to exonerate Crispin. He gets very angry with Fausta, and ends up, and I'm not sure exactly how he did this. The only thing that I've read about this is that he killed her by leaving her in the hot room of the bathhouse, locking her in there, and she died of essentially being steamed to death, which seems like a really terrible way to die, and an especially cruel way to kill your wife who bore you 3 children, right? And Constantine, at the end of his life, was a very kind of broken, paranoid man. He did accept his 3 sons by Fausta, who seem not to have totally fallen out with their father, even though he killed their mother in a very cruel fashion. He accepted them as Caesars. He also had 2 nephews he accepted as Caesars. And so he was holding with this policy of choosing successors and splitting up the empire between different kind of members of a system of rule that had multiple people in it, having multiple imperial courts and all of that. But he was pretty paranoid at the end. And so, that really brings to a conclusion a whole period of great transition in Roman history. The new creation, I should have said this at the beginning, but I guess it's a fitting conclusion. This new creation put into place by Diocletian and added upon in important ways by Constantine is called the Dominate. And this is the form of government that will remain in place until the end of the Western Empire, with the death of the last Western Emperor, Romulus Augustulus, in the year 476. It's something that is different in many ways from the earlier form of the empire, which is called the Principate after the word princeps. This, of course, was called after Dominus. There was some confusion when Constantine died, right? He was a Roman emperor, and so the Senate quickly proclaims him a god, but he was also a Christian. He was being baptized as a Christian. That doesn't make a lot of sense that he would be a god, given that it's a monotheistic system and he only worships God, right? Apparently. And the Christians later on, actually quite a bit later, ended up proclaiming him to be a saint of equal rank to the Christian apostles, which is a bit ironic given, the steaming of his wife in a bath and all of the wars he fought against his rivals, many of which were really out of his own greed and ambition and hubris. And so, this is problematic in many ways, but of course, history has played crueler tricks, I suppose. Right. So, okay. So hopefully that gives us a good sense of this. Next lecture, we will talk about Christianity. Go back actually to before this time, try to account for the origins of it, talk about the broader context of it, and this will prepare us hopefully for a good discussion, first about the Wilken book, and then of course about the work of Augustine, St. Augustine, especially the City of God. Thank you very much.